Stalin, Mussolini, Franco, Charlemagne? Have you ever wondered if the dictators of the 20th century took their cues from the all-powerful kings of the Middle Ages? We have this collective mental image of medieval kings as tyrannical, oppressive brutes who ruled over their realms with an iron fist. While this may or may not have been completely true, we can see a potential parallel between this paradigm and that which played out on the world stage less than a century ago. In this video, we're going to examine whether or not it would be fair to categorize medieval kingship as an early form of the dictatorships that arose hundreds of years later. Just a quick note before we begin, this video is absolutely not an endorsement of any political ideology. It is simply a scholarly exploration of the parallels between two ruling styles of two different eras. With that said, let's travel back through the centuries and meet some of these medieval kings to see if they fit into our modern ideas of totalitarian dictatorship. We'll start as we usually do with Charlemagne, easily the most important and consequential ruler of the early medieval period. We find ourselves in St. Peter's Basilica in the year 800 AD, with the sun shining brightly through the windows and reflecting off of the jeweled crown that Pope Leo III is placing on the head of the man known by contemporaries as Carolus Magnus. This is a seismic event and a harbinger of the increasingly blurred lines between political and spiritual power in the Middle Ages. Charlemagne has realized that being crowned emperor by the Pope himself in Rome is the greatest way to consolidate his rule and use the symbolic regalia of the Catholic Church to send a message that God stands behind his imperial might. This was a revival of imperial majesty under divine Christian authority, and it was a shrewd and calculated move. By reviving the old Roman imperial title of emperor in a Christian ceremony, Charlemagne was marrying the magnificence of Rome with the glory of the church to reflect an ideology of divinely sanctioned imperial power. This soon became a popular and important part of what it meant to be a medieval ruler. Kings were invested with sacred objects similar to that crown placed upon the head of Charlemagne by Pope Leo that reinforced their legitimacy in more visible ways. The 9th century Holy Roman Empire's crown, which was likely made for Emperor Otto I or his successors, was adorned with biblical images and inscriptions. One enamel plaque on the crown shows Christ in majesty with the motto, "By me kings reign," while others depict Old Testament kings like Solomon and David. This was powerful imagery to the medieval mind, which was thoroughly marinated in biblical stories and artwork. Even the lowest peasant would have known these stories and would have recognized the icons of Christ and Solomon and David that were illustrated on the crown. To be able to cut across class and educational lines with such powerful images was a key tool in the arsenal of medieval rulers. The images and mottos on this crown specifically sought to link the emperor to biblical authority and wisdom, implying that he ruled in the tradition of King Solomon and by the will of God. Coronation manuals like the 14th century English Liber Regalis laid out how monarchs were anointed with holy oil and crowned with orb and scepter, with each element carrying some kind of symbolic meaning of justice, Christian faith, and the kingly office. These coronation rituals became more and more complicated and ornate as time went on, with Richard II's ceremony in 1377 serving as a sort of high watermark. It could only be described as excessive. Richard was a young king, only 10 years old, coming to power in a turbulent time, so he wanted to show off to everyone in attendance that he was the right man, or boy, for the job, which meant he was presented as God's anointed, and his entrance to Westminster Abbey turned into a massive procession with pageants and theatrical displays. You can see this with 20th century dictators as well, like Mussolini, who famously staged these huge rallies where he was bathed in light and paraded on balconies with Roman-style iconography to paint himself as this metaphorical mixture between Julius Caesar and Jesus Christ. Other dictators, like Hitler, often lacked solid institutional legitimacy in the early days of their regime, so these excessive public displays filled that gap and essentially overwhelmed the people to force them to accept their new ruler. Much of this ties into my next point, this deep medieval desire for kings to connect themselves to the great rulers of the past, whether they were real or mythical. The genealogies preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other similar manuscripts trace the royal lines of several English kingdoms back to the pagan gods and biblical patriarchs. The West Saxon king's lineage is carried back all the way through Woden, also known as the Germanic god Odin, and then even further to the biblical figures Noah and Adam. Obviously, this seems pretty far-fetched to us today, and if a modern president tried to pull a stunt like this, we would just laugh. But to the medieval imagination, this was seen as completely plausible. These sorts of ancestral connections created a mythic origin story for whichever dynasty was in power, depicting the kings as these heirs of a sacred lineage that began as far back as the dawn of time. The Anglo-Saxon monk and historian St. Bede, writing a bit earlier, notes that kings like Hengist and Horsa, who were the founders of Kent, were said to be the sons of Woden. Later works, like Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain from 1136, further popularized the idea of British kings descending from the heroes of legend. The history opens with the tale of Brutus of Troy, the grandson of Aeneas, the founder of Rome, who escapes the fall of Troy and travels far away, eventually becoming the first king of Britain. Geoffrey takes it even further than this, weaving in a history of British rulers, including King Arthur, as the heirs to this supposed Trojan British line. Medieval English kings loved the Arthur story, and it was especially popular among the Plantagenets as this continued motif in their dynastic story. King Edward I saw himself as Arthur's successor during his campaigns in the 13th century, even having Arthur's suspected tomb opened in 1278 to show that the mythical hero was not only real, but actually dead. Later on, King Edward III in 1344 explicitly conjured up Arthurian lore by proposing a new version of the Round Table, which of course eventually inspired the creation of his famous Order of the Garter for esteemed knights of the realm. Continuing this idea even further, we find similar origin myths outside of England as well. The Frankish monarchy in France claimed descent from Francus, the son of King Priam of Troy, effectively giving themselves a Trojan lineage to rival that of Rome itself. This wasn't some fringe idea either. It shows up in chronicles going back to the 7th century and gets repeated and embellished over time. The same thing was happening in Spain, where King Alfonso X commissioned a sweeping national history called the Historia de España, which traces the kings of Castile all the way back to Noah, through the Visigoths, and then right into the Christian kings of his day. In Scandinavia, we get the Norse sagas portraying kings as literal descendants of Odin, who is reimagined as a powerful king from Asia, conveniently interpreted as Troy, again. This wasn't just about vanity, it was a serious propaganda tool. By tying themselves to legendary founders, pagan gods, or biblical patriarchs, medieval kings gave their rule the weight of cosmic inevitability. These weren't just kings, they were the rightful continuation of sacred history. And of course, we see echoes of this tactic in the 20th century. Benito Mussolini frequently invoked the grandeur of Imperial Rome, going so far as to model his regime after the Roman Empire in both aesthetics and rhetoric. Hitler's Mein Kampf frames the German people as a kind of chosen race destined to reclaim a mythologized past. Both of these leaders, like the medieval kings before them, used these distant, often fabricated lineage stories to cast themselves as the inevitable heirs of a glorious and heroic civilization. It was less about truth and more about legitimacy through myth. That brings us to our final theme, propaganda, which is really the glue holding this whole medieval power structure together. If you wanted to convince your subjects that you were chosen by God to rule, you needed more than just a shiny crown and a fancy title. You needed stories, art, rituals, and pageantry that proved it. One of the best examples is the Bayeux Tapestry, a 230-foot-long embroidered propaganda scroll celebrating William the Conqueror's invasion of England. It doesn't just document the conquest, it justifies it. You see Harold Godwinson, the English king that William defeated, swearing an oath on holy relics and then breaking it and then dying horribly in battle. Every stitch speaks to the narrative that William is king because God wanted him to be. Other kings got in on the act too. The French kings were anointed with oil from the Saint Ampoule, supposedly delivered by the Holy Spirit as a dove to baptize Clovis in the 5th century. Louis IX went even further. He literally brought the crown of thorns from Constantinople and supposedly paraded it through Paris barefoot, framing himself as a second King David and his rule as sacred beyond question. All of these actions, whether they were stitched, sung, written, or performed, functioned as state-sponsored media before newspapers and TV. And when you fast forward to the 20th century, you see a shockingly similar playbook. Hitler's regime flooded Germany with iconography, swastikas, eagles, uniforms, and banners, all carefully designed to feel eternal. Mussolini's speeches were choreographed down to the lighting and camera angles. Franco's regime weaponized Catholic imagery to make his rule seem like a divine restoration. In each case, the ruler controls the narrative. Stalin took it even further and developed this full-blown state-run propaganda machine to strengthen his cult of personality and create these grandiose artworks depicting him as a wise father figure and a military genius. The difference between medieval and modern propaganda methods is that instead of monks and tapestries, we have film reels and microphones, but the goal is exactly the same: convince the people that the ruler is not just in charge, but meant to be in charge. So what do we do with all of this? Are medieval kings basically just 20th century dictators with fancy crowns? Well, not exactly. It's important not to flatten history or pretend that political systems from different centuries are directly equivalent. Feudal monarchy and modern totalitarianism are separated by 1,000 years of technological, economic, and ideological change. But that doesn't mean they're totally unrelated either. In the end, it's not so much that medieval kings were necessarily dictators in the modern sense of the word, it's that modern dictators knew how to take what had worked in the past and twist it to their favor. But what do you think? Is there a connection between medieval kings and the modern dictators of the 20th century? Let me know in the comments, and if you liked what you saw today, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm John, and this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.